Hello, everyone from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. My name is Dr. Amanda Bittner, professor with Memorial University's Department of Political Science within the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, as well as the director of the Gender and Politics Lab. I'll be your host for today. I hope that you're all well and safe as we begin to see some light at the end of this long pandemic tunnel. It feels like it's been extremely long and very tunnely, and I'm happy for that to be slowly ending. If it in fact is ending, it's not clear yet. I'm here today with a panel of internationally renowned experts who I'll introduce in more detail in a moment. I know those of you attending can't see who else is in the room for the event, but we have a full house, more joining every second, so we are delighted about that. Actually, I'm so excited about this event. These speakers are like the badass powerhouses of Canadian politics, and so I'm really thrilled that you could all be here with us today. We're going to begin today's event with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located and the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. Today's session is brought to you as a collaboration between Memorial's Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Department of Political Science, the Gender and Politics Lab, as well as the Office of Alumni Engagement as a part of the MUN Alum Days. The Office of Alumni Engagement is focused on offering many ways for you to connect with Memorial from anywhere in the world. They're working diligently to create opportunities to celebrate, socialize, mentor, learn, and advance both your career and improve your life. Memorial currently has over 100,000 alumni globally. You should check out their website at www.mun.ca/alumni to find out more ways to get involved, from mentoring, meetups, to online book clubs, webinars, and more. The Gender and Politics Laboratory in the Department of Political Science at Memorial University brings together students and faculty working on research related to gender and politics. The lab is involved with research, teaching, and mentorship activities at Memorial and in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. The lab's research activity to date incorporates comparative research on women's participation in formal politics, the role of gender in political attitudes, and the measure of gender in survey research, as well as the role of motherhood and parenthood more broadly in politics. Thank you all for joining us today for a discussion centered around Canadian politics, where we go from here. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. A brief Q&A will follow the presentation. I will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat windows, which you'll find at the bottom right of your screen. Please try to keep your questions short, and I encourage you to post your questions when you have them, as we want you to take away as much as possible. You are not able to unmute your microphone or turn on your video. You're streaming live, but a final reminder that this session is also being recorded, and you will receive a link to the event in a follow-up email. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel of experts in no particular order. Dr. Kiera Ladner is a Canada Research Chair in Miyo, Indigenous Governance and Digital Sovereignties, and professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, as well as former Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Politics and Government. Her research focuses on Indigenous politics and governance, digital sovereignties and archiving, gender, women in governance, and resurgence in terms of both women and youth. Next, we have Dr. Deborah Thompson, who's an Associate Professor of Political Science and Canada Research Chair in Racial Inequality in Democratic Societies at McGill University. She's a leading scholar of the comparative politics of race, with teaching and research interests that focus on the relationships among race, the state, and inequality in democratic societies. Dr. Thompson's award-winning book, The Schematic State, Race, Transnationalism, and the Politics of the Census, is a study of the political development of racial classifications on the national censuses of the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. Dr. Michael Orsini is a professor in the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies and the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. He specializes in critical approaches to policy and politics, and he is completing a book on the role of emotions and affect in policymaking. Elizabeth Goodyear Grant is a professor of political studies and director of the Canadian Opinion Research Archive, CORA, at Queen's University. Her research and teaching focus on elections and voting behavior, political representation and marginalization, political communications, women and gender, as well as Canadian politics more broadly. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for being here today. So I'm going to give each of our panelists about 7 or 8 minutes to talk on the topic of their choice in relation to kind of Canadian politics. Where do we go from here? And then I will kind of lead the discussion, monitor the chat and the Q&A from there. So our speaking order is going to go in order of last name alphabetically. So first, Dr. Goodyear-Grant, G, followed by LMNO, so followed by Dr. Ladner, followed by Dr. Orsini, and then finally going to Dr. Thompson. And for those of you who are in the audience, at any point, you can put your question in the chat. I'm going to be taking notes and keeping a speakers list. I will come to you as much as I can or as quickly as I can, hoping to get to as many of you as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Goodyear-Grant.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to Amanda, to the Gender and Politics Lab, to Chris with the Alumni Relations team. So it's just wonderful. So where do we go from here? So I guess the question is, what's the from in that, right? And I want to interpret that just for a few minutes as the context of the federal election that we just had last month, as well as the pandemic more generally. It's been an unusual time period in Canadian politics and in society generally, and I think there are some notable patterns that are raising concern for me and others, but there are also some silver linings or like interesting developments. And I look at all of this today and in much of my research from a gender lens. So I'm highlighting things that are relevant to gender and representation, gender and policy, and so on. And within that, I'm really cognizant about and want to incorporate a focus too on other identities within gender, right? So like focusing as well on like Indigenous women, racialized women, and so on. So one of the big patterns, I did a lot of like media stuff during the election, as probably all of us did. And that's fun and wonderful. And, like literally probably half of my requests were to speak on or shed some light on the People's Party and their so-called rise or surge. Now, I mean, that was obviously greatly overblown. The party didn't win any seats and it didn't end up winning, it definitely increased its share of the national vote, but it's still a minor sort of marginal party. But within that, we talked a lot in media and I thought a lot about the shift in political discourse and the growth of toxicity and frankly hate in the campaign and in politics generally. And that's actually been ongoing for a while, and it's definitely been heightened by the pandemic, or not by the pandemic, but in the context of the pandemic. In part because various groups in society, and this is a global network of extremist groups that is very well connected, well organized, and is frankly quite good at communicating. There is a global network of extremist groups that has been using the pandemic in a sort of opportunistic way to further like drive or stoke up hate and resentment and anti-government feeling and to corrode trust in public officials and public institutions and so on. So we're all familiar with that. And we saw it probably most starkly in the US over the past few years, but it's happening here too. Okay, so one of the things that's been really super worrying for me is the extent to which this toxicity gets directed at marginalized communities. We saw that in the pandemic, like, with a rise in sort of like anti-immigrant sentiment and particularly anti-Asian hate. But in the context of the campaign, we saw it come out more than ever before towards public women. And here I'm including not just candidates and politicians, but like journalists. And in the aftermath of the election, there's been a lot of discussion in the public about how this happens, what it looks like, and what professional organizations, so like organizations that sort of govern journalists in Canada, but also like media outlets who employ journalists, what their responsibilities are to deal with this. And I think about this too in the context of the high profile departure of some sort of senior or like well-established women in politics over the past few years. And, I'm thinking here of people like Catherine McKenna, who blatantly said that part of her reason for leaving politics was because it was so toxic or that it wears you down. I have been reading Selena Caesar Chavan's book, where she's quite clear that toxicity in and outside Parliament really discouraged her and sort of like, sort of turned her off from wanting to pursue public life. And then we have high profile departures too from people like Mamala Kakak this spring and her like, absolutely iconic speech on leaving Parliament made it very clear that this, like that institutions obviously were not built for her or people like her, and that it became clear to her that she couldn't do the work she wanted to do in government. So anyway, this is one of the things that's of great concern to me is the sort of corrosion of the tone and content of public debate and politics, and the effect that this is going to have on representation, descriptive representation for sure, but also substantive representation as well. Just really quickly, I mean, I guess I'm focusing more on the pessimistic side than the optimistic side. I think in terms of where are we going, I see some bright spots on the horizon related to especially policy outputs. One of the things that I'm most excited about with this government moving forward is the national childcare program that this government is setting up. So the government has promised $28 billion to establish a truly universal childcare program across the country, has negotiated agreements with 7 provincial governments and 1 territorial government. Another government, Ontario, which is where I'm living right now, has indicated its eagerness isn't the right word, but its cooperative stance, and they are in talks right now to establish this. And this is a sort of effort unlike any other that's come in the past too, right? This government is investing unprecedented amounts. This government, in its agreements that have already been concluded, has stood firm in its requirements for the cash, which is nonprofit spaces have to be established. There has to be a focus on better training and opportunities for childcare teachers. And then also the hard line on the cost piece. The cost has to be down to $10 a day within 5 years. This is transformational for people in this country who are paying on average $10,000 a year or more for childcare. So pre-kindergarten childcare. I mean, this will be economically transformational for women and many other groups. It will be also socially transformational. Like it's truly exciting, and for all that I and many others have critiqued this government for, its inflated feminist rhetoric. This is one piece where the government's definitely walking the walk. So anyway, I'll stop there and look forward to our discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Goodyear-Grant. Dr. Ladner.
I'm so happy to be here today, and thanks so much for the invite. And I just want to give a shout out to both Chris and Amanda for organizing this. Amanda, it's great to be there virtually, if only virtually. Where to go from here? I think that from the prairies, I grabbed a mug this morning that really shows it all. And it's really more what's next. And I think that living in the prairies, coming from both Alberta and Saskatchewan, I think that the what's next is how do we get out of the situation where I feel like I'm living right next to two failed states? And that's a really scary sentiment on the prairies when we look at what is happening. But I'm not going to talk about prairie politics. Or COVID, that is what I've been doing most of my work on, and that's why I'm really centered on this idea, this failed state, and I think we need to do a bit more work on that and what happens when things break down. And I think we are on a verge of a breakdown in Saskatchewan at least, and we saw that breakdown in the spring here, and it's going to be interesting to see what we see next in provincial politics. And I hope that someone gets onto some of this work and is doing some of that work. What next? Coming out of the election, I'm going to take it coming out of the election as well. And coming out of the election, I don't follow elections very often, but this election I followed. And I followed because I saw 80 Indigenous candidates. My count was actually 72, but I have to put my shout out to Chad Cowie, one of my former master's students who's finishing up his PhD and about to take his job somewhere come next fall. But his count was 80. We'll go with his count. 11 Indigenous candidates were successful. This is one less than a 2015. So we see a huge engagement, and we see some firsts. We have the first in Labrador. We have an Indigenous candidate or Indigenous MP in Nova Scotia, 2 in Ontario, 2 in Manitoba, 2 in Alberta, 1 in BC, Nunavut, and Northwest Territory. But they are shut out in Saskatchewan, and that really does say something. Where Saskatchewan Indigenous population is the highest percentage of the population in that province. Shut out in Quebec and New Brunswick, and then no candidates in the Yukon or PEI. I'm really mesmerized by this and mesmerized by this level of engagement, and that this has changed so much since Indigenous people really engaged with the political system starting in 2015, and we see a huge shift with that first Trudeau election, and a huge shift as organizations such as Indigenous Get Out the Vote and other organizations really start up. And there's this mass engagement with the Canadian political system, something that I never saw coming. And, you know, I will admit that fully, I really didn't see coming. But what's really significant about this is that level of engagement, while we have more candidates running, we have less Indigenous people voting this time, and we have less engagement with Indigenous voters. And I really want to bring this to bear because it is, where do we go from here? There has to be more engagement with Indigenous voters. We have situations where Kenora or Janine Seymour was running, who was a U of M alum in law, quite a close race. If you consider the fact that there are 7 communities that had no polling stations, had no ability to vote. We have communities in northern Manitoba, communities in especially northern Ontario that had no ability to vote and were not told that they were not getting polling stations. We're waiting outside where polling stations have been the last 2 elections, and there were no polling stations. We're not told, we're not informed. This is a really serious situation. We have communities that were giving polling cards for 2,000 kilometers away. Another community told to go and vote in a community 280 kilometers away, and both are flying communities. So how do you do that? You're going to spend thousands in trying to vote if you wait and want to go to the polls. So I think that this is a really serious issue to look at. And I think that where do we go from here if Indigenous people are going to continue to be part of or to be engaged in the political process, that there has to be some movement to allow Indigenous people in, if Indigenous people want to continue to vote. And we'll see what comes next. One of the big things that I think came out of this election and is where do we go from here is this whole matter of reconciliation. When O'Toole, the night of the election, said that reconciliation is the keystone of Canada reaching its potential, I just about whatever. You can fill in the blanks. I was shocked, but I was shocked because, as Andre Bear said, the Liberals have baked reconciliation into Canadian politics, and there's no walking back from reconciliation. But what I'm shocked about is not that reconciliation is there, but that how we're viewing and how reconciliation has become mainstreamed, or as I would say, white streamed. Reconciliation means something completely different to, I think, those conservative voters than it does to Indigenous people. And so we are going to see more and more of this great divide. So as Indigenous people come in to engage the political process, even post Jody, and that's still a shock, that Indigenous people are still engaging post Jody or post other candidates leaving and saying that there's no place for Indigenous people in the House. If we see this continuation of this great divide in reconciliation, I think that we are going to lose ground and lose a lot of movement that we've seen of Indigenous people becoming part of the Canadian process. And I say this because reconciliation for Indigenous people is not this trickle down incremental change that looks like nothing is really changing. Yet for Canadians, there was a survey that was done through partners of mine at the Association of Canadian Studies and Leger that was released for September 30th, where reconciliation the survey was an open-ended question and allowed 2,000 Canadians to write in basically how they viewed reconciliation. 20% of Canadians, 28% in BC, said that they really didn't know what reconciliation was, or they didn't care. Didn't know or didn't care. And I was really shocked that Leger put those both together. 11% acknowledge or suggest that reconciliation is an acknowledgement of past wrongs and that a need to ask forgiveness. 10% suggesting that it's clean drinking water, 6% suggesting that basic needs need to be improved and quality of life. Nowhere in those numbers, not until you get to the very bottom of the list, where you see 2% suggesting that it's improving a relationship or honoring treaties, and both of those according at 2%. It's starting, and I think that big divide between Indigenous people and Canadians, there's always been a big divide between Indigenous people and Canadians and how we see a way forward. But one is really asking and sees reconciliation as fundamental change and transformative change and a transformative relationship. And the other sees reconciliation possibly as not much change at all, clean drinking water, let's apologize, let's start over. And the two won't meet. And so I see the future and where we go from here is really a problem of two visions of reconciliation. And so I haven't seen a lot of change or a lot of movement, given the fact that reconciliation now is the hottest buzzword or one of the hottest buzzwords in Canadian politics. Jody Wilson definitely won political debates over without even showing up. But we're not seeing a lot of fundamental movement or a lot of congruence or a lot of convergence in how we see and define the problems that really do divide the country. And I think that that, to me, is where do we go? We need to actually move to think about what that transformative change is. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ladner. Dr. Orsini.
Is that me? Okay, thanks. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to the organizers and those of you who've joined us. Just as an access issue, I wanted to describe myself, if it's okay. I'm 6'1". I'm wearing overpriced roundish tortoiseshell glasses. I have rapidly thinning hair and a trim goatee. Also important to remind you, like, you should feel comfortable, do whatever you have to do in this space. A virtual format allows you to do that in a way that sometimes all our in-person meetings do not. So feel comfortable. In my short time, I wanted to try to feel my way through this thicket of post-election fog. So I want to talk about feelings, not my own, but the feelings, emotions, and affects that dot what I'm calling the emotional landscape, the terrain of political struggle. An emotional landscape is just another word for like an environment that includes affect, that includes emotion, that includes sensory experiences, that's sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious. And like a lot of other folks interested in emotions, if we, the argument is that if you want to understand what motivates action, you really need to think about with the emotions that lead, accompany, and result from them, to quote one scholar. Another term, I'm sorry to sort of throw out some terms, is the notion of a feeling rule. And that comes from a sociologist named Arlie Hochschild. And it's a good way of thinking about, as political scientists, too, the norms that police the boundaries of what it's appropriate to feel and express. And I'm listening to Elizabeth also talking about Maxime Bernier, sort of brings that to mind. So emotions are central to the study of politics, but we seem to have a limited understanding of their importance. And Frank Graves was, when asked about it in a survey, said, quote, "First of all, about Canadians, they don't like emotion. It makes them uncomfortable. It's not very male. It's not very powerful. It's not very decisive." And just recently, Toronto Star columnist Susan Delacourt asked whether it was time to take emotions out of our politics. And she was commenting on the nastiness of the recent election and some of the ugly feelings that kind of emerged. And she quoted Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations Carolyn Bennett, who was reelected handily, to support her claim. And Carolyn Bennett said, "You can't argue with feelings. Thoughts, perspectives, yes. Feelings, no. One can never propose that someone ought not feel that way." So what is it about it? What is it about this discomfort? What is it that's making us uneasy? And I think part of the answer, I think, has to do with the kinds of assumptions that still persist about politics, about Canadian politics, about that politics is rational, that it's impartial, and it's devoid of feeling. And on the other hand, we also have these messy ideas about the proper place of emotion, because a lot of civil society actors and social movements are always chided for being too emotional, right? Which is also super gendered, of course, on the one hand. And then bureaucrats, policymakers, are accused of being cold and unfeeling, unable to express basic emotions such as empathy. And so I want to make a case in my, 5 minutes I have left, for thinking with and about emotions and affects as necessary and necessarily messy features of our political world and of our Canadian political world. And also say that banishing bad feelings or privileging good ones is not straightforward. And we can't make Maxime Bernier go away, and some of the emotional responses people have, and some of the ways in which people who support Bernier express themselves. So emotions mattered in the snap election, the one that no one wanted, and they've mattered in previous elections. And they mattered in a different way because this election took place in the middle of an unprecedented public health calamity that was marked by its own jumble of emotions, right? Fear, grief, rage. So I think elections are an opportunity for us to feel politics literally and also figuratively. And it means for me surrendering to the possibility that what happens out there matters to people in ways that might be felt or experienced and embodied. And I think there is we should avoid a tendency to sort of see and explain away emotions as irrational or irrelevant, even when people are expressing feelings we don't support or like or react in our own sort of visceral way to. We need to understand that these emotions are structured by and embedded in broader relations, and resist this tendency to think that we simply know what those emotions mean and we know how they're being expressed. So it's kind of a call for humility too, and the idea that we might think, and a lot of people sort of think that they can understand how people are reacting, but we need to sort of go a little closer, look a little closer. And I think, sometimes when we talk about, it's not just about actors strategically deploying this or that strategy or priming voters. There's a lot of that I think we've seen, and these slick appeals to emotions. I think accepting that the political world's uncertain and messy means we need to ask how people reason with and feel their way through politics. And also recognize that there never was a kind of glory day when politics was this deliberative exercise or paradise. And if there was such a time, you can be sure that the folks at the table were probably mainly white men. And so we don't want to return to that. We don't want to return to any kind of idea of a glory day. So in my last few minutes, I just wanted to sort of highlight 4 sites of what I'm saying are emotional contestation. And some of this dovetails, I think, with what some of my colleagues are going to raise or have raised. The first concerns kind of what I worked on a short piece with Kelly Gordon, the Prophet McGill, who has probably one of the biggest sort of, I would say, probably one of the most knowledgeable folks about conservative politics in Canada. And we tried to sort of make a case for revisiting this idea that we understand the emotions that are attached to kind of partisan affiliation, right? And this idea that rethinking the shorthand we always perform when thinking about feelings and partisan brands. And I think, the political right always being synonymous with anger and fear. And it also tried to invite us to reconsider how ideology shapes the emotional contours of political life. Think about this sort of kinder, softer version of conservatism embraced by the party leader, is he still party leader, Aaron O'Toole. The shift in tone from the master remoter Trudeau, who departed from sunny ways to sort of weaponize fear in his efforts to be reelected, and that kind of worked, right? So the link between ideology and emotions, one that's interesting. The second one concerns how emotions intersect with race. My colleague who will be speaking, Dr. Thompson, is more eloquent on these matters, and you should read her work on the exoneration of Black rage to get a clearer idea of this. But I just wanted to say that we should also think about how, the idea of racialized emotions, the idea that, racial domination is not just about sort of what one scholar has said is a matter of presumably objective practices and mechanisms driven by the socioeconomic material interest of actors, right? People who are seen as racially subordinate experience the unfairness of the system, and they develop emotions to match this what they feel are segregate this kind of segregation. And I think it helps us to link how we always focus on negative emotions, and when thinking about racial politics in Canada and elsewhere, we need to think about the whole gamut of emotions, right? That expressions of love that emerge from social movements, Black justice movements, are just as important in thinking about how we move forward and how we kind of demolish what the scholar calls the kind of emotional skeleton. Do I have a minute or so to go? Okay, sorry, 2 more points. Third is on what I'm calling sort of settler sorrow and regret that I think my colleague Dr. Ladner sort of also called upon when thinking about reconciliation. As Trudeau landed in hot water for his decision to spend the day surfing in Tofino a few weeks ago, a callous decision, a terrible decision. But I'm interested more in how what one commentator sort of talks about how statements of moral feeling are kind of elevated to what he calls a governing strategy. Scholars like Audra Simpson talk about Trudeau as a kind of weeper in chief. And this act of feeling badly after the fact is part of what people have also talked about as settler moves to innocence, right? The way for non-Indigenous people to perform regret And this, I think, shifts the gaze onto settlers' feelings of sorrow and really away from Indigenous people and any kind of tacit or important concerns. So Audra Simpson calls this kind of a structure of affective governance, where we govern by appearing to repair the hurt feelings without expending any effort to transform colonial structures on which these relationships rest. And then lastly, I just want to say a little bit about disability. Trying to do some work on disability, and I think a lot of the emotions that surfaced in the wake of COVID-19, the discourse of vulnerability around seniors and people with disabilities, I think, was one of the most concerning and most, I think, brimming with affective kind of energy. I think about a politics of disposability at work. On the one hand, everyone is feeling compassionate and caring, but also the shame and stigma about people whose lives are not like ours, who encounter stigma because they have so-called pre-existing conditions, like we've heard in the case of the teenager who died in Alberta, who everyone heard also had a pre-existing condition, as if that justifies someone's death. It's no wonder we don't talk much about disability in the realm of Canadian politics or politics in general. As Michael Prince has said, and disabled people are not seen as full citizens. They're not seen with rights and duties and obligations. They're spoken about and pitied, but rarely permitted to speak on their own behalf. So I don't need to remind you that about 1 in 5 Canadians identifies as disabled. And I'm conscious too that telling you this is problematic because it presumes that you should only care about disability because one day you might be disabled too. So that's all I think I've gone over. So that's all for me. I hope you'll agree that shining a light on the emotional landscape of politics is a necessary part of what it means to engage in political debate and engage in reasoned debate as well. Okay, thank you. Sorry to go over.
Thank you, Dr. Orsini. Dr. Thompson, it's to you now.
Great, thank you. So I'm coming to you from Montreal, which is, of course, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. And I want to send a thank you to Amanda, who called us the badasses of political science, but herself is a total superstar, and Chris on the technical side. So let me start with, instead of talking about where we go from here, which, spoiler, I don't know. Let's start with where we used to be. So in the summer of 2020, which was not that long ago, we, meaning the world, was in what many people called a quote unquote racial reckoning, right? We had massive protests literally on every continent, including Antarctica, where there were Black Lives Matter signs on like science stations. Millions of people around the world were protesting police violence. These protests were the biggest, the most diverse, and lasted longer than any protests we've seen in history. Many people in my networks, Black scholars, were calling this the third Reconstruction. That's a kind of an American terminology, but Reconstruction being like the era that followed the Civil War, when Black folks were incorporated into the polity in meaningful ways. We had Black senators elected. There were Black people elected to local office, like Black people could vote, right? There was like a real recrafting of the polity as we knew it. And here in Canada, the language of Reconstruction doesn't really work, right? It doesn't work not because racism never existed here, because racism has always existed in Canada. I can talk to you about it if you're interested in the history of that. And in fact, Keith Banting and I recently published an article in which we argue that there has, in fact, been persistent racial inequality in Canada in spite of many of our egalitarian policies, like the welfare state, like universal health care, like a race-neutral, quote-unquote, immigration policy, multiculturalism, and the Charter. And part of the reason why these policies have been so ineffective at combating racial inequality is that they were put in place when Canada was still like a really, really white country. And so they were never meant to alleviate racial inequality as such. But this is all to say, Canada hasn't had these like critical junctures in race politics, meaning like we haven't had these windows of opportunity that end up like creating circumstances whereby we can redefine the political landscape as we know it
in the same way as we've seen in the US. Arguably, I think we've had these moments when it comes to language politics. This deserves kind of further elaboration, and should think about it, like the Quiet Revolution and the 2 referenda in Quebec, and the ways in which those outcomes have redefined our polity as we know it. But in the summer of 2020, we saw this like unique, really unprecedented circumstances that put racism, and specifically anti-Black racism, on the Canadian political agenda. We all know why. Obviously, the video of George Floyd not just being murdered, but being tortured, right? The video was 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The trial revealed he was actually tortured for much longer than that. There was a shocking, horrific video that kind of galvanized this movement, which began in Minneapolis, which has its own interesting radical history of anti-fascist organizing. And importantly, the confluence of both like the murder of George Floyd and COVID really worked together to create this moment that we saw in the summer of 2020, and for a variety of reasons. One of which was that, I think that both racism and COVID involve questions of how we conceptualize the common good, right? Like the ways in which we are asked to make individual sacrifices in the name of the common good, and what that might mean for how we together can try to build something that's more egalitarian for all people. Now, while we seem to be rounding the bend when it comes to COVID, we cannot say the same thing about racism. And I think that I'm going to be such a downer here, but I think that the moment that we witnessed in the summer of 2020 has now passed. And if we measure the moment itself by white people's commitments to racial justice, the moment has passed. White public opinion on their support of Black Lives Matter has dropped to levels that are lower than before when George Floyd was murdered. And there was basically nothing said during this last election campaign about anti-Black racism, like, to be honest. Now, there were some moments like, of course, the NMA Paul's issues with the Green Party were largely driven by a whole lot of racism and a whole lot of sexism, in my opinion. And there was that really interesting moment in the English debate when the moderator, Sachi Curl, asked Yves-Francois Blanchet why he supported Bills 21 and 96 here in Quebec, which she said, like, marginalized religious minorities and Anglophones and allophones, and Blanchet shot back, those laws are not about discrimination, they're about the values of Quebec. And 65% of Quebecers viewed that question as being wildly inappropriate, and it has been widely interpreted as Quebec bashing here in this province. And many federal leaders jumped on that bandwagon and said the question's inappropriate, like, and came to the defense of, Quebec's right to implement discriminatory bills. And I know I only have a minute left, but like, let me just say that the moment has passed, and this fits a long-standing pattern, right? So like reconstructions were always followed by redemption. Redemption being like a moment, like a long moment where we see the resurgence of white supremacy, a disproportionate backlash to any kind of efforts to put racial justice on the agenda. This is a tale as old as time. It is so incredibly predictable. And we're in the backlash now. This backlash is being defined by the claims that wokeism is being taught in our universities. The idea that some of our colleagues in political science think that they can say the N-word in the classroom. As one of 5 Black women in political science, I'm just going to say, no, you can't. Stop it. The ways in which like there's general apathy towards Black suffering, the ways in which the struggles of racial minorities are consistently pitted against the struggles for Indigenous people, while we, Black folks and Indigenous folks have formed coalitions for centuries, truly. And also the ways in which the calls to defund or abolish the police have been ignored. In some places, we've gotten police out of school. That's good. Cops should not be in school. But in most cities across Canada, there have actually been lot of increases in police budgets. So where we are now is not where we were then. And I just want to end with a kind of word of caution about our desire to return to normal. Do we want to return to normal? You know, the murder of George Floyd was so incredibly normal that like a week later it happened to Jacob Blake. You know, like, do we want to be the type of society that can sit restfully in that kind of normal and mourn it and want to see its continuance, as Dion Brand wrote, or can we dream of something better? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Thank you to all of you. You've given us a lot of food for thought. And as the moderator of the conversation that's to come now, I'm left with, oh, where do I start? Because there's a lot here. So I really appreciate your thoughts on this. As you were speaking, one of the sort of questions that came to me as all of you were talking is the role of the state in creating the way in which we live together, the way in which we work together. And, you know, one of the things that came up as Dr. Ladner was speaking, this issue of Elections Canada not having polling stations in certain spots. That's a clear role of the state kind of issue, right? Where the state's not working the way it's supposed to in terms of providing all citizens with a vote. To start, because I think we can go into all kinds of directions. To start, I guess I'm wondering where you see the role of not just governments per se, but governing bodies, institutions like Elections Canada, electoral management bodies, other kinds of tribunals, courts, things like that. Where do you see that in moving us forward? And what do you see happening in future years for Canadian politics in that kind of a direction? It's a little bit outside of what all of you have talked about. So I'm changing the direction a little bit. But I want to get your thoughts on kind of institutional structures and what changes we might have seen in the past, what changes we might see in the future, and what we think that might mean for society, broadly speaking. I know it's a big question. And I don't have a particular person to pick on. So does one of you really want to tackle that question or start the conversation on that? I can just pick at random, of course, too. Elizabeth, go ahead.
I volunteer. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's a real political sciencey question, isn't it? I mean, the state can do incredible things. There's no doubt about that. Look at during the pandemic when within weeks, the state had created a income support and business like payroll support system that, you know, was really like quite awesome. And of course it wasn't perfect, but I mean, it was not only celebrated in Canada, but outside Canada as well. On the other hand, watching the state, when there is political will, marshal resources and accomplish these things, great things, in such a short amount of time, highlights its inaction on other things, right? And it also underscores the fact that political will, not state capacity, is what underlines the failures, some of the failures we're talking about here today, like failures of genuine reconciliation with Indigenous people, failures to actually engage with the moment that came up in the summer of 2020, you know, that where there was fertile ground and will within the public to actually engage in some transformational change. So to me, the state is really like a double-edged thing, right? And it's dangerous that so much of the state's ability to drive positive change depends on the will of elected politicians. So I don't know, maybe by way of kicking off the discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about political will. And this is, you know, I mean, going back to like a gender and politics lens for a second, one of the great failures of many democracies is not having rules that require women to be in legislatures, but require the political will of parties to actually just do that job, which is not that hard to accomplish. I'm wondering if any of you want to jump in on this. Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Ladner, go ahead.
I think that I would just want to jump from where both Elizabeth and Deborah have left us. This 2020 was a phenomenal moment. It was a phenomenal juncture for in terms of Indigenous politics, and it's a very different juncture. And we see two things really coming to bear during the pandemic. We see communities taking up their sovereignty, taking up jurisdictions, and exercising powers to hell with the Indian Act. And that was really phenomenal, and it's a phenomena that I think is going to continue. And I talk about this a lot in terms of stealth sovereignty, and I think that that's hopefully we will see that to continue. That it really doesn't matter what the state and what state structures say. It will be how community is defined and how communities really reframe and retake governance and governance in their own right. But the other moment, that real critical juncture that I see that relates to this conversation, happened in Mi'kmaq, happened in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, where Mi'kmaq fishermen decided to exercise their constitutional right to fish, a right that had actually been proclaimed in the Marshall decisions by the Supreme Court. Huge moment. And the state, despite the fact that this had been proclaimed and Indigenous people were exercising a constitutionally recognized right, that which had been affirmed by the Supreme Court, we see the way that this has really impacted Canadian politics, and that this was really this lost moment. And it was a lost moment because, maybe the Trudeau government could have acted better, but I think that they tried to really play all sides of this debate. They tried to work with fishermen and be on fishermen's side, but at the same time, they tried to say that they were really, and I think, Michael, you said it best, they really tried to play that emotion and say, oh, we apologize for not being there when all of your traps in your community and Mi'kmaq property were burnt down and people were hurt. Oh, we'll apologize for that. But it really is this lost moment, and this juncture between these two communities, between Canada and Mi'kmaq people, really also shows up in that election. And we see that in the turfing of Bernadette Smith, or Bernadette Jordan, sorry, the former Minister of Fisheries, could not succeed, could not win her seat back, despite everything that she had done and trying to play both sides. Really lost both sides, really lost that moment. And really, that I think that moment has passed, but we're about to see that again as fisheries pick up everywhere. Yes, there have been more agreements signed in the last few weeks again in several Mi'kmaq communities, including Listugush. But I think that we are about to see huge tensions in that fishery. And even where agreements were signed, we have fishermen, Canadian fishermen, that are absolutely rejecting the state and the state's ability to uphold Mi'kmaq fishing laws. So I think that we have this disjuncture, and one hand of the state may move in one direction, but we need Parliament and we need other state actors and other agents to actually uphold what has been the rule of law. If Canada is going to be a country based upon that rule of law, that is where reconciliation, I think, has to also come from. And I think that is emotion, and I think we have to deal with those emotions, and reconciliation is this emotional issue. And we have had this failure to actually deal with that in this country, other than to say, oh, we'll apologize for what has gone on, maybe to both sides.
Thank you. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming up in the chat and in the Q&A section, which I don't think that our attendees can see, but we can see. So I'm going to keep kind of going with by drawing from those questions. But before I move on to more questions, I want to give Dr. Orsini a chance to respond to this. I mean, it's pretty clear to most of us who study politics, but also who just have an interest in politics, that politics of fear, politics of anger, politics of emotion are like, emotions are a big thing, and we might like to think that we're rational beings. But I think most of us know that, you know, that body feeling that comes at you sometimes is not about rationality. So I'm wondering if you can comment on what Dr. Orsini and Dr. Goodyear-Grant, or sorry, Dr. Ladner and Dr. Goodyear-Grant have said. Dr. Orsini.
Yeah, can I say a quick thing about the state and then pass it on to Deborah? I think, you know, I think it was a long time ago, this Wendy Brown wrote a book called States of Injury, where, you know, she kind of made this really important argument that one has to be really careful about states that sort of harm cannot be turned to for sort of repairing that harm. So it is a contradictory position. What I would say, though, is that states have been successful in supporting and cultivating strong social movements that actually turn on them, and that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to sort of cultivate resistance that can actually put a check on the kinds of things that governments try to do. So I think we kind of lost that in the 90s. We were sort of acknowledging the importance of that. The Quebec government, which has had some difficulty acknowledging systemic racism, actually gets that part right about supporting community organizations. And I think that's what sort of invigorates my politics, or the kind of politics that I'm interested in. On emotion, I guess the main thing there is that emotions can actually transform, you know. So, you know, the kind of shame associated with being HIV positive in the 80s and 90s was transformed by activist groups into an anger that was really politically productive. We can do that. So the idea that sort of like we're stuck with fear and we're kind of immobilized by fear. I think what's interesting is how, you know, some people who study this call affects sort of free radicals that kind of attach on to things and change and whatever. We should think about how anger can be mobilized in productive ways, and how compassion can be really corrosive in many ways when it doesn't actually result in any concern for all the people, underpaid people working in their healthcare system who are racialized or Black. You know, so I don't know. I think it's just the short answer is really trying to imagine that uh, if the landscape or the way in which we understand and the way in which we engage in struggle is marked by emotions and affects, they're not immutable. They can actually be you know, politically productive, even if they seem to be negative, you know. So this idea of negative and positive emotions. Sorry if that's a long answer.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Right now, you've got me thinking about the toxic positivity and good vibes only, and the dangers associated with that. Dr. Thompson, I'm wondering if you want to jump in here.
Yeah, I'll just say something really quickly. In democratic societies, one of the things that we often think is that if citizens engage more with the state, that's good, right? That's about bringing folks into the democratic process, whether through consultations, whether formal voting. We think like more engagement with the state, more engagement with the government is good. And I just want to like put a pin in that, because for a lot of Black folks and Indigenous folks and other and poor people and unhomed people, our engagements with the state are coercive. They're frequently violent. They're full of surveillance, and they do us harm. You know, and so like this is the second face of the state that Joe Sauce and Vesla Weaver talk about, the ways in which, you know, more engagement for many of us actually is actually fundamentally like undemocratic in that kind of ideational way. And I think about the state a lot because of my work. And I always get my students to go back to that Weberian definition of the state that we all know by heart, right? The state as an entity that maintains a monopoly over legitimate use of violence in a given territory, right? And I just want to like, you know, like that's the police, right? The police maintain a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence in given territory. And those of us who are invested in a kind of like abolitionist politics, we just like all we want to do is ask questions about like, what if we created a state that instead of violence at its core, had something else, right? Had something like an ethic of care and concern and compassion, right? Had something about that was more than like this superficial ideas of reconciliation, but rather about like restoration, like justice, like these actual ideas that would do, you know, that are intent on creating a community out of like concern rather than out of coercion.
Thank you. That's really thoughtful. Okay, so I'm seeing more questions in the chat, and I'm going to kind of lump some of them together into kind of broad categories. I'm going to throw a category back at you guys right now to think about. I want you to think about the role of media. So one of the questions in the chat there is talking about whether or not we should be sharing images of particular things. So I want you folks to think about what is the media doing? Is the media causing harm, and in what way? Do we need to do something about this? And then two, I want you to talk about both sidism in particular, if you could. So this idea that, we saw it the other day, people talking about classrooms where they're teaching about the Holocaust and then saying, well, you got to have the opposite side, as if that's in any way reasonable in terms of education. So I'm wondering if any of you want to sort of jump in to talk about media right now, broadly.
That sounds like Elizabeth.
Okay, I'm good with that. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it gives me the opportunity to say unequivocally that part of the reason why we're seeing this sort of growth in toxicity in politics is that media are platforming it, right? Did people see the other day this big sit-down interview with Maxime Bernier that the CBC did? Like in front of Parliament. So not only this like devoted segment to this leader of a marginal party. Like, by the way, did anyone see Annemie Paul getting a sit down in front of Parliament with a prominent CBC journalist for an exclusive one-on-one? No. In front of the Parliament building, like with all the symbolism of the trappings of power and legitimacy and so on. So to me, that just sort of that just echoed what happened during the campaign. And I go back to like when I was talking at the beginning, half the media requests I got from both national and international media, like the New York Times and the BBC, wanted to talk to me about the People's Party. And I was like, you do know that this is a party that has no seats in the House of Commons and that has polled no more than 5% of the national vote ever. And they're like, yeah, no, but still, you know? So, I mean, I think it's understandable in a sense because this party, especially all the anti-vaccine, anti-lockdown, anti-restriction opportunism that the party has seized upon, is very dramatic, right? And there's rallies and people yelling at doctors and nurses and the prime minister and like throwing gravel at the prime minister and stuff. Like it satisfies news criteria of like drama and sensationalism, but it's doing a massive disservice to democracy and political debate in Canada, not only because their positions and their rhetoric are, I mean, I keep using the word toxic. Maybe I should probably think a lot about what Michael is saying about emotions and stuff. Like, you know, like some of the fear and grief and frustration that's being expressed by people who are getting sort of pulled into this movement or whatever you want to call it is legitimate. But by platforming it constantly, it's giving people a sense that these opinions or this mode of politics is more widespread than it really is. And it's de-emphasizing the sort of bulk of public opinion and the sort of median voter, so to speak, whose views and whose mode of politics is very different on average. So I think, and it's contributing to the whole both sidesism. I mean, someone else can talk about both sidesism and this sort of like weird equivalence that seems to have developed between, you know, platforming equally both 80% of the voters and the 5% of the or 20% of the voters who are like anti-system or whatever the case may be. So I'm really disappointed in a lot of the coverage and a lot of the focus on the People's Party and these kinds of movements, associated movements too, like all the anti-maskers and anti-lockdown people, but more generally too, the sort of like white supremacists and Christian nationalists and your sort of general grifters that are out there doing this, right? So yeah, I think media is in part driving this.
Thanks. Does anybody else want to jump in there on that? Or add to that? Yep. Oh, you're muted. Dr. Rossini, go ahead.
Unless Deborah or Kiera want to jump in first, I guess I'd just say, like, it's always difficult to sort of comment on the role of the media because it's so easy, an easy punching bag in many respects, and some of it's deserved. I would say one would be careful because the same media that sort of vaulted Justin Trudeau in sunny ways, and more kind of positive emotions, is also kind of perhaps giving undue attention to folks like Maxime Bernier. The other thing is with respect to that sort of one-on-one interview with Travis Danraj that I watched that too, is that most people didn't watch that because most people don't watch CBC National. So we have to be also kind of cognizant of the kind of media that people engage with, and it's usually not the national CBC National News. So the idea that he was given a platform, a major platform, yes, but it's probably more significant to be paying attention to what's happening in sort of social media circles, which I'm completely clueless about most of the time.
I suppose that's true. I mean, I wasn't necessarily speaking to like what the size of the audience was, but the legitimization of him. I mean, and he's just an example too, right? It doesn't have to be Maxime Bernier, but like the legitimization of what are essentially sort of like fringe parties, right? And I mean, I know there's some problematic dimensions to what I'm saying here, but just in a sort of larger sense, it just seems really problematic to me. And also, like in other, I mean, he was given even more of a platform in some other media outlets too, like Post Media and stuff like this, owing in part to the content of the stuff that he's talking about. But yeah, I take your point for sure. CBC National is not a huge viewing audience.
Okay, so I'm conscious that we have 7 minutes left in our time together, and I want to give each of you one last chance to talk about something of your preference. So I'm drawing from the questions that I'm seeing in the chat and from the Q&A, and I know that you folks can all see those things as well. I want to throw out so I threw out the word media at you. I want to throw out the word education at you. We're all educators, we're hyper nerds, we're really into reading and thinking and arguing and having these conversations. And we have the opportunity to work with students who are learning, who are keen, who tell us so much and who teach us as well. I want to ask you to think about, in your kind of closing comments, we've got about 6 minutes left, what is the role of education in politics? What is our role as educators in politics? And what does that sort of mean for the future, as we might either know it pessimistically or imagine it positively, like sort of optimistically? What are your thoughts? I'm just gonna randomly go, actually no, I'm not gonna go random again. I'm gonna go in the same order as before. So I'm gonna start with Dr. Goodger Grant and then go alphabetically again. So you each have a minute.
What is our role as educators? As educators of the political world? Oh my gosh, I don't have a really good answer for that. I mean, I guess I don't think of my role as an educator. I'll just say like maybe one thing. My role as an educator is not to provide information, I think, but to like help students acquire and discover the skills that they need to make sense, like truly make sense of the political world. So, you know, the critical skills and the you know, all that goes with that. So I don't think information so much as like, you know, helping to develop critically thinking, you know, observers.
Thank you. Dr. Ladner, your turn.
I totally agree with what Elizabeth said, so I'm just going to leave it at that. But I'm going to talk just a moment on what our role as researchers are and what our role as commenters are. And I think our role as commenters and researchers is to do that uncovering and to teach that critically, but to uncover. And there's not this need to tell both sides of a story because someone else is telling that story. And I think we need to uncover and to teach and to explain why that story hasn't been told. And I am so, I do so much work on missing and murdered women. And going back to the media question, I see time and time and time again how much emotional work is done by families just confronting the media. And so I think as researchers and commenters, providing that barrier, providing that buffer so that it is not families and communities that have to take that emotional response and do that emotional work and always be the commenters, but holding that media to account. So one of my projects right now is really looking at how media has done nothing. Well, I can't say done nothing, but done the whole white stream media account of murdered and missing women has being about dramatization and re-traumatization and the performance of violence. And that's what Indigenous women are there in the media. I think that Jody Wilson has also been portrayed very much that way. So talking back to the ways in which Indigenous women, to the ways in which Indigenous people are portrayed in media. And I think that we can go from leadership to community to issue to issue to issue. And I think that that is our role to really get us away from that performance of violence and talking about those underlying issues.
My turn?
Yep.
Yeah, I just last year blew up my honor seminar in Canadian politics class with this idea that I was kind of sick and tired of the same old, same old. And so I think my answer would be that we need some undisciplined activity. And so we're reading Billy Ray Belcourt in my class on Indigenous issues. Billy Ray Belcourt's a theorist, a poet, and so my role, I do think, is engaging students who are interested in Canadian politics with the literary works, art, and other sort of areas, so that we can kind of reject in some way the disciplining that happens in universities. It doesn't mean I reject entirely political science, but I think I'm trying to imagine. I'm hoping we can imagine and prefigure a different way of thinking about Canadian politics.
I like this idea that it's our responsibility to kind of expand what is thought about. I think that's really, really important. Dr. Thompson.
I'm so glad I get to go last because then I had 3 minutes to formulate a coherent thought. I think the role of educators is a really important question, given, again, the extraordinary backlash against critical race theory, for example, in the US, which, as someone who lived in America for a decade, is hilarious because my students were not being taught critical race theory in high school. I can guarantee you that. They knew basically nothing of America's racial history by the time they got to me. And I think that there's a sense out there that, students go to university and it's this mechanism of liberal indoctrination, which, everyone no, it's not. Calm down. And I say this again as one of 5 Black women in Canadian political science. And when I was hired at McGill, I was one of 12 Black faculty members out of 1,700, right? So this is not the function of the universities isn't to indoctrinate students in that way. In fact, many of us have to work against these formidable obstacles of conservatism, of white supremacy, of heteronormativity that are embedded in universities. And so my goal, as always, is to, in fact, create subversives as much as possible. If anyone's interested, our good friend, Dr. Ethel Tungohan, has a wonderful podcast called Academic Aunties, where she talks a lot about the university and the nature of fighting against some of our more brutal and incompassionate tendencies. So I'd recommend you all check that out.
Thank you. Yeah, I love this idea of creating subversives. It's actually really hard to do that, I think. Thank you all for really great. I feel like I wish we were all here because we need to go on for a lot longer. And I'm looking forward to a time when we can actually do this together in person with coffee or tea or wine or something. But this has been really great, and I really appreciate that you all agreed to do this with us today. So we're out of time, unfortunately. So I want to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors for today. And I know Chris, our host, is going to, there it is. Here's our list of sponsors. Thank you very much. And this brings us to the end of our time together. Thank you all for attending and for your great questions. And as I indicated earlier, the session has been recorded and we'll be sharing a link in an upcoming email. So keep your eyes on your inbox. You can share it with your friends. And please check out the other MUN Alum Days events still to come throughout the month of October, which include a MUN Alum 101 webinar on October 19th centered on gender diversity that features Memorial PhD candidate Taylor Stocks. We also have an online storytelling session on October 26th, hosted by Dr. Jan Bewley of the Faculty of Education, called Teacher Tales on Tuesday evenings. And capping it all off on October 27th will be the 40th Annual Alumni Tribute Awards, where 7 outstanding alumni will be recognized. This will be broadcasted live online. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. I look forward to chatting, hopefully one day in person. I really like to nerd out in person one day, but this is a good second best. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you, folks.